Okay, well, thank you everybody for having me today. I am really honored to be here speaking to you. And I've said to a few people in the room who I know that I feel a little out of place because I just can't stress the importance of the work that you all do and how if it wasn't for this work, I wouldn't have this job that I love so much. So thank you for everything that you do. And Dr. Carrie Kelly, who just recently joined the board of Breathe Utah, asked me to speak today. And so naturally I said, well, what do you want me to talk about? Because she knows I really love to talk. And she said, well, let's stick with the theme and talk about how the research plays into policymaking. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But first, I do just want to give, for those of you who don't know about Breathe Utah, just a little quick overview of what we do. So we are a Salt Lake-based nonprofit air quality education and advocacy group. We've been around for about 12 years officially, and we have two approaches to our mission of improving Utah's air. And there's a lot of groups that work on air quality in Utah. And what really sets us apart from any of the other groups is we have this fantastic K through 12 education program that we are just so proud of. And it's transformed into this wonderful thing that it is today. So how it started was my founding members realized that there was a real need for air quality education in Utah. And I'm not from Utah. As mentioned in my introduction, I'm from Lake Tahoe. When I first moved here, I also learned that a lot of people growing up here didn't really have any sort of education on air quality. It was just, we have bad air. It goes away when there's a storm. And that was pretty typical experience when I first moved here. People would say, oh, it's just the inversion, and don't worry, it'll go away when a storm comes and blows it away. So we came up with this program, and we used to go into classrooms and do in-classroom visits and assemblies. And, we'd reach 30 kids at a time or a couple hundred kids at a time. And we did have our program up in the Logan area and Utah County down here, and of course in Salt Lake. So we did that for several years and was very successful. And we really quickly outgrew that program. There was a really high demand, and we just couldn't keep up with keeping volunteers, and we didn't have much money at the time. So a couple of staff people. So fast forward a few years, we've been doing our professional development workshops for teachers for about 5 years now. And we found this incredible woman named Dawn, who's our education coordinator, and she is a retired 8th grade science teacher. She's anything but retired. She is involved in anything science education in the state. So we wrote some curriculum. We have 12 lesson plans. We almost have 13. We're finalizing one of them right now. And we switched our focus on teaching the teachers. And so we figured if we teach a teacher and provide them with the equipment and materials they need to teach our programs, they will impact every student that they have throughout their career. So we make it a program that teachers actually want to come participate in. It's an expensive program. And when I am fundraising for this program, I'm not kidding you, every time people say, well, can't you make it cheaper? Can't you do this? Can't you do that? And the answer is no. And we have it down to an exact science of teachers need to come to professional development for relicensure points. So we give them their points. We compensate them for their substitute reimbursement up to $100. We do require them to pay a little $15 registration fee, which incentivizes them to come and not be a no-show. And then we give that back to them. And we provide them, you guys are all scientists and I am not, so I call these things experiment kits. But we provide them with lots of hands-on materials to demonstrate the topics that we teach in our program. So you can see we have a density bottle there. And then I don't even know what that apparatus is called, but it's what we model incomplete combustion with. So we have several of these things and we give them to each teacher. And another question I get is, why don't you just give one per school? Well, we know that what would happen is that would end up in a closet and never be checked out, collect dust, and it would just be a waste. So that's our education program. We're so proud of it. We have back of the napkin calculation, you know, we could reach about 43,000 students a year with this program. We host about 6 of these workshops a year. We could certainly host a lot more if we had the funding. There's really high demand for it. And then the second prong of our approach to helping Utah's air is we have a policy program, which I am so passionate about. As you can see here, I am in a legislative committee a few years ago, just beating home about Tier 3 gasoline, one of my favorite topics. We also provide a lot of information to the public with our legislative bill tracker. So I just took a little screenshot of our website. But our policy approach is really unlike any others. I was really fortunate to step into Breathe Utah after our founding members really laid a foundation for us to have a very moderate approach. And I feel very fortunate for that because, again, I'm not from Utah. So when I moved here from California, I had a real different idea of politics. Utah politics are completely different, especially when you're working on environmental issues. So you have to learn how to speak the language in Utah politics to be successful. And that doesn't mean that we don't have really ambitious air quality goals and targets in our minds and ideas for policy that would really move the needle. We just are very practical and realistic about what we can do in Utah, because that's where we're doing it. So that's kind of what I'm going to get into, but I think it's a really good segue to talk about how we are always working really collaboratively. We're involved in many partnerships. The very first person I call when I have a bill proposal is Bryce Bird, or one of many DAQ staff, because these are the experts that the state relies on, and we need to rely on them. And it's very apparent when there's policy ideas out there that haven't been fully vetted and haven't been worked with DAQ. And so that's where we always start. I do draft a lot of legislation for lawmakers that come to me with ideas or asking for ideas. Come October, every legislator who cares about air quality wants a bill, and they want it written right away. They want to get a file, and there's a timeline. So DAQ is gracious in helping with that, and that's fantastic. So I'll just get right into it, you guys. So air quality policy sounds easy, right? Well, it is and it isn't all at the same time. You can see this cute little graphic. You know, you set some goals, you determine some reductions, you determine how to do it, then you implement it, and then you assess the results. But when politics gets thrown into that mix, it jumbles that up and everything is thrown out the window. So starting kind of top down, everybody's familiar with different approaches to policy. And specifically air quality. So we have federal programs and standards, and of course, like, yay, Clean Air Act. Thank goodness we have the Clean Air Act. And then also, like, man, that Clean Air Act, it is just causing so many problems for us that we could do so much more if this was changed. So then we have state. We have laws that are passed by legislation, administrative rules passed by the Air Quality Board, economic programs. Then, of course, we have at the city, county level, we have ordinances that get passed, or other economic programs like Salt Lake County's Vehicle Repair Assistance Program, where if you have a car that just doesn't pass your emissions and you cannot afford to get it fixed, rather than getting a waiver and just driving around a dirty, polluting car, you can come in and apply for this program and your car will be fixed. So really great programs at all levels. We have Corbin Anderson in the room, who is the Air Quality Bureau Manager for Salt Lake County Health Department. He's also on my board and the VP, the VIP, so thanks, Corbin. And then, of course, things like burn restrictions. And then we can even take it down to the private sector. And a lot of businesses out there will put into place some internal policies to tackle some air quality, which is really great. I'm on a air quality and health committee through Intermountain Health, which is the one of or the largest employers in the state. And they have a lot of air quality policies internally, including looking at the state's telework policy and kind of mimicking that and seeing what they can do for their healthcare providers and keeping as many people at home when possible for air. So now on to the real fun stuff, the political process. Actually, you know what? Yep, I'm just backed up. Here we go. Sorry, guys. I'm going to skip forward. So I heard it was mentioned in a previous this morning, but the Air Quality Policy Advisory Board plays a role in policy making. And I was appointed that in 2017, right after it was created by legislation. And this is a really fun board. I love being on this board. It's composed of 10 members. 5 of them are legislators. We've got 3 representatives from the House and 2 senators. And then we have other members like Dr. Carrie Kelly is a member. She represents academics. We have another new member from the academics world, and I haven't met her in person, but her name is Heather, and I think she's here. Oh, hi. Yeah, she's on board, one of our newest members. And then we have some other members that represent business interests in the state. And of course, I represent NGOs. So this is kind of what we're charged to do: seek the best available science to identify legislative actions to improve air quality. And that's really where all of the work you guys do comes into play, and everybody at DAQ. Then identify and prioritize potential legislation and funding that will improve air, and then make recommendations to the legislature. So in our first couple of meetings, we had to put together kind of our metrics of how we were going to do this. So we look at, of course, is there an air quality connection? And this is speaking more specifically to if there's a bill out there. And then, of course, what's the emissions impact? And then what's the return on investment? And we take into consideration things like the cost per ton. We're always looking at the cost of other rules, like the area source rules and the thresholds, to see, is this reasonable? And then we either give it a positive or a neutral or no. And then historically what we've done is put together our list, and then myself and my co-chair will deliver this to committee chairs within the legislature, members of leadership, and other lawmakers, really essential in getting things passed, and just letting them know that this has been vetted through our board and this is what we think you should do. So back to that political process where everything just gets either changed for the better or changed for the worse, or everything's out the window and we have something that used to say XYZ and now it says ABC. So, you know, it's pie in the sky thinking that there's this method of, okay, well, we identify an issue. Well, of course, we all care about air quality and air pollution because of the impact to human health, but that's not always the reason why we want to pass laws. And I always say it really depends on the audience you're talking to, because of course the bottom line is human health, but it could be a conversation that you need to have around economic impacts. One thing is our lawmakers love to grow and expand and bring more jobs and manufacturing and all this stuff, but I have to remind them that, well, unless we get a handle on our air quality challenges, we're not going to be able to grow in the way that you would like to grow, because we have this air shed and it's kind of capped right now and it's really full and it's going to be fuller. So those are always kind of conversations that we're keeping in mind, and again, learning to speak the politics of the state where we work, which really leads to, does the science support this proposal? And I think that this is so crucial. And I say it all the time, you know, really informed, really good research in science informs the best public policy. And unfortunately, when the political process kind of gets in there, sometimes that's out the window. And it could be intentional if certain legislators or other people don't like the way the science is looking. They don't like the direction the science is going or what it's showing. The hard reality of the science is this, and oh, I don't like that, so we'll change that. So there's lots of challenges that come with taking all the really great work you do and translating it into a good policy. Another thing is, you always have to think about, okay, is the practical feasibility, is this actually going to work? Can we actually do this? Will it actually reach the target that we're trying to reach? Of course, what's the cost? Is it economical? Is it reasonable? And then it always turns on, is it politically friendly? You have to make sure that your sponsor has the support of their own caucus and enough members of the other caucus to get it through. It really helps if you have legislative leadership backing it. Sometimes the governor's office can help, and as we all know, sometimes they cannot help. And that's really challenging as well. And then again, I always come back to, what's the motivation? Is it human health? Is it economics? Is it growth? Does it matter if we get to the same conclusion? So these are all things that we kind of work on when we're trying to translate your good science into good public policy. Oh, might I mention, politics is another way for the legislative body to retaliate against things that people have done. Like, famous example, the ultra low NOx water heater rule. What a simple thing, a no-brainer to everybody in the room who knows that an ultra low NOx water heater will reduce emissions. Looking at a low NOx or somebody 75%, right? No brainer, right? Well, oh man, they really took advantage of their authority in passing that rule. So then they go in and they mess everything up. And then there's delays, and we could have had ultra low NOx water heaters for what, 18 months or 2 years before we actually even got them in the state. So thank you, legislature. There's another issue where they retaliated against mask mandates this year and changed a rule that allowed county health departments to make rules that were a little bit more stringent. So again, playing politics, we have to deal with that. So again, I'll say it. So research-informed public policy makes the best policy. And there's so many examples of this, but I picked a few that I love to talk about. And a couple of them I really love to talk about, so I'm going to try to keep it together. And if I get out of hand, just wave at me. But one, here's an example of a really great economic program, that the wood stove and fireplace conversion assistance program. So a study done, and I know there were more studies than this, but the one I always come back to is 2015 study, where it really showed that there was just an awful lot of the chemicals found in wood smoke on the monitors. And it really was a significant contributor to the PM 2.5 problem that we experienced along the Wasatch Front in the winter. So what can we do? Well, we tried to do an all-out ban, seasonal wood burning ban, and that kind of turned into a total disaster where people thought we were going after their Second Amendment rights and everything else. They're given rights to burn wood. And so we had to okay, step back, do a little bit more stakeholder engagement, figure out a way. And luckily, a federal program, Targeted Airshed Grant, the state could get some money to do these conversions. Well, it piqued the interest of industrial interests to say, hey, there's a lot of wood smoke on these monitors, and less wood smoke on the monitors means better air and maybe better for us. So they kind of got behind this whole idea, and we were able to get the Governor Herbert at the time, I think this was 2019 or maybe 2018, he, in his governor's budget request, he put in $14 million in extra money for the wood stove and fireplace conversion. And we got a really great air quality champion from the conservative side of the body to run this. I drafted the bill for him. We tried to figure out a way to really go after the people who need the help the most. So we put in some income requirements. We also put in some, wanted to focus a lot of the money in areas where people needed the most help. So areas like the west side of the valley, really wanted to have an education component in that too. So Breathe Utah came up with the Know When to Burn campaign. So we got $9 million for that in the legislature that year. Wasn't 14, but it was 9. And it was a really good enhancement to what DAQ was doing with their wood stove conversions. So that's kind of an example how the study that showed this really translated into something that actually worked and passed. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that after these programs have been in place, we've seen a reduction in the wood smoke on the monitors, hopefully, right? Yeah. So that's an example. And then diesel emissions testing program in Utah County. I'll just speak quickly to this. It's up to the counties to decide if they wanted to include diesel in their passenger car and truck I&M program. And Utah County didn't want to do it. And they wanted to see their own data. So they didn't believe the other counties, the other 4 counties that were doing that it really does work and it's a good program. They wanted to see their own data. So it took years, but we got a pilot program through. They did 3 years of data. They found, yeah, it's a good program. And so we got it actually written into state law, but don't tell anybody. It works a little bit differently, but that was another great example. And Representative Patrice Arendt, who's been an air quality champion forever, was the one that ran that forever and ever and ever. And we finally got something through. And so that was really great. Another example I like to call the 433 dirty old school buses that Representative Handy worked on for 100 years. It seems like definitely about 5 years. And, you know, the argument was, yeah, we know that diesel emissions from these old buses is a problem. We know it's bad for little kids breathing this on the bus. We know it's bad for drop zones and pickup zones at school, but it costs a lot of money. So we don't want to pay for that. So then thankfully the state got a bunch of money for the Volkswagen settlement, and they were able to allocate a little bit of that money, a significant chunk of that money to get rid of some of those old dirty school buses and get some cleaner technology. Oh, now on to my 2 favorites, Tier 3 gasoline. If you don't know what Tier 3 gasoline is, you haven't been paying attention to like so many news stories about this and so many ribbon cuttings and governor's events and this and that. But in other parts of the country, Tier 3 gasoline, nobody knows what that is. And there's this really famous quote that Governor Herbert used to say all the time, and we'd hear all the time in legislative committees. Oh, EPA says that no state would benefit more from Tier 3 gasoline for sale in the state than Utah. And there was this great map, and it showed all these counties lighting up with how wonderful it would be if we could have Tier 3 gas. So easy, right? Well, not so easy, because the state can't regulate sulfur standards of gasoline or force the refineries that operate here to make Tier 3. And every one of our 5 refineries in Utah can comply with the Tier 3 regulation without making it in Utah. They can either average amongst all of their refineries in the nation, or they can purchase sulfur credits. But it makes so much of a difference in Utah that we have Tier 3 gas burning in our cars that we came up with a way to get it done without heavy-handed regulation that we can't do because of that darn Clean Air Act, right? So took several years and lots of stakeholder engagement and public-private partnerships and agreements and handshakes, but we incentivized the refineries to do it. So the state gave them a tax incentive for the capital costs of the investment for whatever equipment was needed to make, basically pull more sulfur out. And then after a certain date, if they were making it, then they were able to get another tax incentive. So that's just an example of something where we couldn't do anything. The state couldn't force these refineries to do it, but we knew that it would make such a difference. And I think it's a big part of the 15% reduction for Wasatch Front ozone. So luckily we have 4 out of 5 refineries making it. Now on to my absolute favorite topic, freight switchers. This is another thing where unless you know a lot about trains or live in Utah, you might not even know what a freight switcher is. How many of you know what a freight switcher is? Yeah, lots of you, right? Well, freight switchers are these just, well, they can be very clean, but most of them are just really dirty dinosaurs of machines that move rail cars around in a rail yard and get them all lined up to go down the long haul. And a study that was done by some of you guys in this room, where you mounted air quality monitors on TRAX trains, when the TRAX trains with the monitors would pass through what's known as the Roper Yard in Salt Lake City, we'd have see these really huge spikes in emissions. And of course, I emailed the wrong slide deck, which had the great visual. Thank you, Dr. Mendoza, for sending me that last night. But that was like, hey, wait a minute, what is this? Why is this spike happening? And what is it? And found out that it was these switcher engines. And of course, because of our climate and the way these things work, they have to be idling 24 hours a day. Or it's too cold, or they're water cooled, or they're just 50 plus years old. But the key here is Union Pacific operates 43, I think, or 49 of the 60 freight switchers in Utah. And they are tier 0 or tier 0 plus, but tier 4 is available. And they're even coming up now with electric and hydrogen electric. And that's great, because a tier 4 is like 90% cleaner than a tier 0 plus. So you think, okay, well, Union Pacific, or the state, first of all, the state just needs to tell Union Pacific to get rid of those freight switchers and get clean ones. And darn Clean Air Act, right? Section 209 of Clean Air Act says, nope, you can't do that. So it's up to the operators to do it on their own. Well, these things cost like $2 million and they last forever. So it's not really a good business model for them to just scrap them, which would have been required under the Volkswagen settlement. So the state thought, well, there's better uses for Volkswagen money, but let's work on a partnership with Union Pacific to see if we can get some of these changed out. And back to dirty old school buses, Steve Handy grabbed this freight switcher issue and went running. And he tried for so many years to get Union Pacific to come to an agreement to change some of these things out, and asking state for money and utilizing other federal programs like DARA to get some funding, because we know this would make such a big difference in Utah. Well, Union Pacific hasn't been the best partner in that, and sometimes they would agree and then they'd turn their back and say no, and there's always an excuse. And so going back to political process, well, it might not, air quality might not have been the motivating factor behind what happened this year with freight switchers, but it was a really important part of the conversation. But luckily, our legislative leadership, our majority leader of the House, Representative Mike Schultz, has a little bit of beef with Union Pacific for some other issues that he's been working on for years. So he said, oh, hey, we're going to go and I'm going to open up a bill file and we're just going to make you change those freight switchers out, which was like, yes, this is so awesome. It might not be legal, it might not work. There's going to be lawsuits if it passes, but so cool, right? So I'm still looking into that. Like, I think we can do it. I think there's a way. So anyway, it at least brought the conversation back, and Union Pacific said, okay, we'll do something. And I am not by any means saying I agree with what they say they're going to do, because I don't think it's nearly enough. And I personally find it insulting that they would say, well, we'll change a couple of them out, make sure they're not zeros, make them 0 plus, or maybe we'll get some tier 2. But DAQ has this wonderful graph, which was in my other slide deck, that shows the emissions from a 0 and a 0 plus, and then like a 2, and then a 4, like way down here, you know? So the technology is there. And DAQ knows that the cost per ton analysis on this is really good. It's right in line with other area source rules. I think it's $3,400 or $4,300 a ton or something, which is right there in that range. And the technology is there, and it makes a difference. And this is another example of that darn Clean Air Act. If we could only do something differently. And I think it goes to all the planning that DAQ does, especially looking at ozone. And as Becky mentioned, the SIP is rigid. There's only certain things that fit within these goalposts of a SIP. And unfortunately, it can't be stuff like this. But when the state has to look at other ways of cleaning the air, I think it's the science that really says, hey, this is worth it. And this is how this will work. And it has to be a part of the conversation if the state's going to do anything that isn't within those confines of a SIP, if they're even allowed to do that. So Another wonderful thing that's happening right now because of research and attention that's been brought to the issue is Great Salt Lake. This year, more than ever before, lawmakers are really paying attention to the rapid declining of the lake. And air quality is definitely one of the concerns, but there's a lot of concerns around the diminishing lake. I like to talk about the air quality and the dust, and I've had lots of conversations with Dr. Kevin Perry about his study, and I think that we can directly look at things that have happened in policy and policy making to look at this. Now, it started off with, hey, we want to move the prison, and we want to make sure that the lake bed soil and all the heavy metals isn't going to, harm the people that are out there. And so it was like, all right, study this really quick. Should we buy the land? They bought the land, and then the study continued, and they're finding more and more out. And just a month ago, I was asked to talk about dust, so I called Kevin Perry again and had another wonderful conversation with him. And the first thing he said was, isn't it great that they're paying more attention now, at least? And yes, it is. And there was even a bill that passed. It was House Bill 317 this year, that the sole intent of that was just looking at ways to mitigate the disruption of the crust so that we don't get that dust transport. And of course, not to mention, we need money to do all of these things. So lots of money was appropriated, record numbers, over $50 million. So the next big thing, and I always say the next, but I know the state's been working on this for a long time now, but ozone. And here's why we care about ozone, right? Harms human health, the effect to our bodies. And this is a real challenging issue for the state. They just had a really great stakeholder meeting where they're asking people for input and suggestions and ideas. And I think this is an area where we're going to see where the research really matters the most, because we have to figure out, where is this coming from? At least the man-made stuff in Utah that we can do something about within this SIP. Where is it coming from, and how are we going to mitigate this? And how are we going to bring these numbers down? And I think that that's just so crucial to anything that happens in the state here moving forward. And I love hearing the NACS conversation earlier about how they're considering dropping the levels of PM 2.5 and yes, very likely ozone. And it reminded me of one of my very first experiences in the Utah legislature working on air. A lawmaker who is no longer a lawmaker there, he retired, but he said, well, and this is in 2015, they're lowering the standard. Why don't they raise it? If they raised it to like 90, we wouldn't have any red air days. Problem solved. And this was not funny joke, haha. He was serious. He really wanted to know why they weren't raising it rather than lowering it, because we only have a problem a few times. And if it's up here, and we're down here, and sometimes that's the mentality that we are faced with. And that's obviously not the right answer. Lowering is probably the right answer. And then of course, politics come into play, and we'll ping pong back and forth between a Democrat president and a Republican president. And we'll just go up and down and up and down, but that's kind of what's going to happen. Which, another important thing about ozone, and please forgive me if this information is outdated, but there's a lot of stuff that's influencing our ozone here that we really can't do a whole lot about. And it's really important to look at air quality policy on a whole. What are other states doing? What are other countries doing? How does it all interconnect? How does our ozone formate, or when we create ozone here, how is it affecting our neighbors? These are all things that have to be a part of this whole look at ozone and air quality globally. So that is really basically the end of my presentation. Good luck working on ozone, guys. We're with you all the way. We know it's challenging, so challenging. If you haven't looked at the stakeholder meeting that they did last week or the week before, it was really excellent. So thank you. And there's so much useful information, which is what I'll end on, is the research that you all do is provided in ways to the public. And sometimes it's really hard for the public to go in and figure out what it means or what it says, but DAQ does such a great job in making it user-friendly for people like me who are not scientists, but who can go in and kind of look at these sources and say, oh, I have an idea for how we can address non-road mobile. So thank you so much. And I am happy to answer any questions. And really thank you for asking me to talk today. Perfect timing.
Questions for Ashley? You get to use a cool microphone. Ready, Judy? Here it comes.
Okay, I'm glad I did you. Hi, thanks for that great presentation, Ashley. So I just wanted to go back into your comments about the importance of science informing policy. But and I'm a health researcher, by the way, so all the EPA standards are based on things that people in my field do. But what I am seeing is like this rejection of science in the public, as well as certain politicians that just choose to ignore things. And so what can you do as a scientist when, you know, these key people are the ones that they're not really listening to the data?
What an excellent question. And we ask ourselves all the time. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer for how scientists can deal with that problem, because that is just terrible. Maybe I just believe the science too much, or am naive to things, but I think like this is science, it's there. I think COVID was a really good example of that, where people just became their own experts. They didn't care to hear. They looked at Instagram as sources of information. And like I said earlier, there's something about, you know, politics especially, that if they don't like what the science says, they either disregard it or say it's wrong, or just don't want to adhere to it whatsoever. And that's how I deal with it, is I just turn it around and say, well, you like growth and you like more manufacturing jobs, so you better listen to the science who's saying reduce emissions like this, and then maybe that you can get something that you're looking for. Another thing I think too is the imminency of dangers from air pollution. It might not be imminent enough and happen to you fast enough for people to really take it seriously. And another tool I have is like, oh, you want the feds to come in here and take over the air quality planning? And that's, I think, another thing where they just don't believe that that will happen. But I think that just being the myth buster as much as you possibly can and dispelling it, and I hate myself for this sometimes, but I'm always like commenting on the news stories, like behind my keyboard, like trying to put the right information out there, because there's so much misinformation out there, and that seems to spread a lot faster and viciously than the right information. So not a great answer to your question, but turn it around. Yeah, it's really hard, and it makes me sad for everybody who works so hard for you guys.
Great. Ashley will be here for the rest of the day, as I understand it. And so please take the time to ask her more questions if you have some, but please join with me in thanking Ashley again.